And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, creator of the Woodlander RPG, a illustrator, cartoonist, and now a game designer, the one and only Alexander Johnson. How you doing today, man? Or tonight, depending on your time.
I'm doing well, thank you.
I'm doing all right on my end. So, I suppose I'll start with the humble beginnings, in a sense. Walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick. This is one of the long-standing traditions of the monastery.
Yeah, I've been playing role-playing games for at least 2 decades now, probably close to 25 years. My introduction to them was back around like 2000, 2001. My dad got out his old copy of Hero Quest and introduced me and my brothers to that. I'm not entirely sure why. I don't remember what prompted him to do it. I guess just because he wanted to introduce the hobby to us. Since we were getting old enough to understand more complex games, because he's a board game collector and designer. So we've always been surrounded by a variety of card games, board games, that sort of thing. So we played that and we really liked it. And from there we moved on to proper tabletop role-playing games, focused more on more complex character builds, making your own characters, rolling a lot more dice. I think we dabbled in a few systems. I think he was just trying to see what stuck, like what we liked, or what he was interested in at the time, like what new books he got. But the one we played the most that I remember was D20 Modern, which is essentially Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, but in modern times, or at least for the early 2000s.
Yeah, I'm no stranger to D20 Modern, and I've covered its successor of sorts on this channel here.
So from there, it's always been something that I've been playing fairly casually. My twin brother and I, in high school, we set up a role-playing game club as an after-school thing with a friend of ours, and we were hosting games. It got pretty popular, as far as I'm aware, as far as the clubs in our high school went. We had a good turnout, so we did that throughout high school. I think it's still around technically, although it morphed into just a general like board game, card game club. Since college, though, things got a lot harder to coordinate with our friends, since we all like moved away, and then different time zones and scheduling has always been an issue since then, as I'm sure you can commiserate with.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I can certainly understand that. I'm no stranger to that, though I seem to have had better luck than others in regard to that.
Mm-hmm. It depends on where you live, and it depends on everyone's schedules.
Yeah, pretty much. But with that in mind, that it sounds like even before that there was a lot of experimenting with different systems. Um, would it be,
Before.
no, just in general that
Oh,
there was a lot
yeah.
of jumping around between different systems and seeing what worked and what didn't when it came to your RPG background.
Yeah, I've played a good number of systems. Granted, a lot of them I haven't played in at least a decade. Um, at the time, we just sort of went with the rules. It wasn't until more recently that I started thinking more critically about game design. When I started developing Woodlander, I looked into that a lot more and broadened uh, my horizons a bit in terms of like what other sorts of games are out there.
Yeah, I can get that. And when it comes to Woodlander, your current project, was this an idea that you had been kicking about long before you put pen to paper? Like like it had some incarnation at your table in the past, or was the route to its creation a bit different?
Um, well, I technically started developing it back in 2019, and the first iteration of it was a a modification of the mouse guard RPG, since that was one of the few systems I personally owned and was more familiar with, since I had the rulebook to read and refer to. And so like I've always been a Red Bull fan and a fan of like anthropomorphic character fantasy, which Red Bull is more or less the most popular and most like readily thought of example, but it's not the only one. So I wanted to, at the time, I wanted to try being a game master more, and since that was the system that I was most familiar with, I tried running a Redwall themed campaign with my brother and my friends briefly. But then I realized like, oh, the system doesn't quite work for the conventions of the setting and the characters that I had in mind. So I was looking around at other systems, because the only other one I was really familiar with was like D&D and other D20 systems. Those are the ones I had the most experience with. And Mouse Guard was very different. I liked how different it was, but it was a little too different, I think, because I didn't think I quite fully understood the rules. Coming from a D&D focused background.
Yeah.
So then I was looking around online for other like animal centric games and what they had done, or just looking at other systems in general and seeing what sort of mechanics and rules they implemented, and what made sense, what made like more sense logically to me, like what felt better in terms of gameplay, and what seemed to fit the tone and conventions of the source material I was trying to simulate through the game. And so I put together a more refined version, and I'm just since I had a hard time scheduling sessions with my brother and my friends, like I said, after like when we were in college and after college especially. So I tried putting together an in-person game at a local game store that fell through, largely because it was like right right when COVID was hitting, so no one was going out anywhere. So then, like, okay, I guess we'll try to put together a group online, and so I set up a Discord server and just put out a general social media post like, "Hey, I'm putting together a Redwall themed game. I'd like people to play test it and join in the campaign." And then I've been doing that. Since about 2020, really, going through various iterations of my game as I noticed flaws and was introduced to more like other disparate systems and what they were doing. So the current iteration is very different from what it first started out as.
Which is fair, and since you mentioned looking around for other games that did this sort of animal based setup, I am curious if anyone had brought up Ironclaw to you, because that's a name that always gets brought up in these kind of conversations.
I know of it. I don't know much about it. I've had people pointed out like, oh, like, hey, what about Ironclaw? From what little I do know about it, it doesn't sound like a system I'd particularly like, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know where I would really get a copy. It seemed that one, that's the typical like kind of furry characters, but that's not really what Redwall is.
No,
they're more normal animals. They're just anthropomorphized, so they can walk, talk, and wield weapons, but they're not humanoid necessarily. And I wanted to focus more on the players being able to do animal things or feeling like their characters are actual animals, not just humans wearing masks, which was something that I was disappointed with various other systems, like the few other systems that I've found since conducting my research, many of which have been released within the last few years, actually. So this is sort of a trend, I guess, a current trend. The root, like Mouse Guard, kind of did it, but it didn't allow you to play anything other than a mouse.
That and Mouse Guard it wasn't interested in a sandbox. It was interested solely in emulating Mouse Guard and the various areas within the comic. Which there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I get the feeling that's not particularly the kind of energy you were trying to go for.
I don't know about that. Like I said, I don't think I still don't fully understand how to properly conduct that game, even though I've read through the book like twice. I'd have to find someone who does know and play it.
Yeah.
I've gotten a little bit more of an understanding watching some videos, but I'd have to try playing it again to really get into the groove.
Yeah.
Torchbearer, which uses the same general system, it was also designed by Luke Crane.
Yeah,
there's a lot more. It seemed a lot more in line with what I would like. I'd go with that system, that game, since it's basically the same game, but it's a little bit more detailed, less abstract. But yeah, Mouse Guard wasn't quite there, and I just wasn't fully integrated into the rules to properly use it.
Yeah.
But I did like many of its ideas. But in terms of being a mouse, of the systems I've encountered, it's the one that really tries to take into account the various animal aspects of the characters, because in that one the mice are inherently good at hiding, foraging, and I think climbing, something like that. But several of the other systems that I'd come across, like Mouse Ritter and the Root RPG, which I was excited for at the time when I learned about that coming out, because I liked Root as a board game. Those completely ignore the fact that the characters are animals. They either like they don't mechanically provide any uniqueness for being an animal. It's all.
It sounds to me
aesthetic.
like they were a bit more narrativist than what you were looking for.
Yeah, they're focused more on the idea, but not actually stimulating. Like it's like, oh, you can like I'm playing as a mouse, but it doesn't feel like you're playing as a mouse. It's all just fluff, which was which was disappointing. So I wanted something more more accommodating to the fiction. So I've gone through many iterations of my game's rules before I settled on something that I both liked mechanically, both in terms of like my own personal tastes, but also what I felt sort of served the tone of the settings I had in mind, like the original source material and stories it's intended for, and intended to simulate, which are heroic, but not high fantasy, not something like modern D&D where you're basically just superheroes.
Yeah,
I've heard in that regard, like,
I've heard the superhero thing a lot. Although, I think that thing can apply just as much to, and there's a whole debate that can be had about how new that whole superhero concept is. I personally find the whole thing a bit of forest for the trees. Since by nature of playing adventurers, you are playing people who are a bit separated from the rank and file.
Yeah, well, that's the point I'm trying to make, is that in stories like Redwall particularly, but even other stories like similar stories like the Mistmantle Chronicles, and the characters come from very humble beginnings, and usually they are everyman. They are the everyman, so to speak. So they're not just adventurers by trade. They're unlikely heroes. They're not active heroes. At least not at the start of the story. So in those stories, they often have like children being heroic. They have the elderly being heroic. They've got like cooks and scribes, like standing up for themselves, their family, and their homes to defend them from the villains. They're not just already trained fighters and experienced like travelers and adventurers from the start. Although there are many characters like that, they're just not the only characters. So it's sort of a like step up and do your part kind of. Like I said, unlikely hero stories.
Yeah.
So that's my system accommodates that sort of narrative structure and character background.
Which I can certainly get. Now,
and
go ahead.
Going back to what I meant by the superhero thing is that like these stories are the stories that my game's inspired by is they're very low fantasy, so they're not, you don't have wizards casting fireballs or people with super strength necessarily, but the characters can still do heroic things. So I wanted a system that made it feel like there were greater stakes involved whenever characters got into a conflict and were trying to resolve it. So they don't really have superpower like abilities or magic spells. It's a lot more mundane than many other other fantasy games out there, admittedly.
Well, although when it comes to that, there's a wide variety out there. But with that in mind, you said that this has been iterated upon quite a bit compared to how it was originally. Now, in the current form, the form that you're kickstarting, it is using
Yes.
a success-based die pool. Was
Yeah.
that something that has largely been kept, or did it have to have a few steps to get to that point?
No, that was not consistent. I was experimenting with different dice mechanics from the start. The only thing I knew I wanted to do was keep it restricted to six-sided dice, just because I wanted some accessibility for players. Like, everyone's familiar with six-sided die. It's the stereotypical die, and they're very easy to get in bulk.
You can
So
get a
they're
decent
very
amount of them for
affordable.
$1.
Yeah, like you can get a set of a dozen for like $10 locally. So that was really the only through line that I've kept since day one. But like I said, it started out as a mouse guard mod, trying to make it a little bit more like in like D&D, since that's what me and my friends were familiar with. So that used a dice pool. I quickly realized, though, that with those rules, you could very easily get into a situation where the game master would say, like, okay, make a roll, and then you literally wouldn't have enough dice to actually attempt the roll because you wouldn't get enough successes. So I'm like, okay, gotta figure that out. And then I switched to something more akin to like something with a dice curve, something that was more or a bell curve for the dice. So just like a 2d6 plus a modifier, because I thought a bell curve would be more balanced. Because one thing I didn't like about D&D was how swingy the D20 is. So I wanted something a little bit more consistent. But that had its own limitations. And then I came up with the current system, the one that that the Kickstarter rulebook uses, which is ironically back to a D6 dice pool, but I've solved the issue of not having enough dice to actually attempt a task. So in the modern system, you roll a number of dice equal to your skill level, but instead of counting a certain number of dice that roll up as a certain number, like in Mouse Guard, it was 4, 5s, and 6s kind of as a success. The number that counts as a success is dependent on a difficulty rating, and your only goal is to get more successes than your opponent, rather than trying to meet a set number of successes. So in that way, it's still kind of swingy. But the more dice you roll, the greater chance you have of rolling a greater number of successes. But a novice character could still beat the odds and overcome a more experienced opponent or a formidable task, rather than being blocked out due to unfavorable modifiers or an insufficient dice pool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see that. So with that in mind, when it comes to is it still a success based pool, or is it a sum based pool?
It's
Servers?
success based.
So with that in mind, what would the threshold be? Since with a lot of success based approaches, it's a case of every die over a certain value is treated as a success, and you need a certain number of successes in order to have a successful roll. Is it in that kind of vein, or is it a different approach?
No, it's still in that vein, but the number that counts as a success shifts based on the difficulty of the task. So instead of it always being like a 4, 5, or 6 on the d6, like in Mouse Guard, it could be a 5 for one task, or it could be a 1 for another task, depending on the situational modifiers. So there are three. The skill checks are conducted as they're always conducted as competing dice rolls between the player character and an opponent.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's an inanimate object like climbing a wall or picking a lock on a door, or attempting to strike an enemy. So the enemy would be actively dodging in that case. So you've got the player character's skill level, which determines how many dice he rolls, and then the opponent's skill level, which represents either an opponent, like an actual NPC's skill, like competency at performing the task, like the player character, or the skill level that would be deemed, standard for attempting a task when trying to overcome a barrier or obstacle like a locked door or a wall. And the third factor is the context, the situation that both the opponent and the player character find themselves in, which is dictated by things like the weather, lighting conditions, like the character's relative size or position to one another, like flanking or being like prone on the ground, and that shifts the difficulty rating up and down. And it's a shared difficulty rating between the player character and the opponent. The opponent is always trying to roll equal to or under that number, and the player character is trying to roll above it. Since it's a D6, it starts at 3 is normal, so there's a 50% chance for each side, for each of their dice, to be counted as a success. If it's in the player's favor, it'll be lowered, and it could be lowered down to a 1, in which case the opponent would have to roll a 1 on any of his dice for it to be considered a success. So even if he's rolling 6 dice, and the player character is rolling 1 die, that 1 die has a 5 and 6 chance of being successful, whereas the other guy's 6 dice each only have a 1 in 6 chance. So his superior skill evens out a bit at that point in terms of the odds, but he's still fairly pretty. It's still pretty uncertain whether or not he'll actually succeed and beat the novice character. But that goes both ways, where you could be both outmatched in skill and be contending with an unfavorable situation. So the difficulty rating could be raised up to 5. So it ranges from 1 to 5. So if you're dealing with a difficulty of 5, your opponent is very likely to roll at least 1 successful die, whereas it's going to be very unfavorable. So you'd want to have a lot of dice to roll to try to even the odds. And players are encouraged to think ahead, strategize, and try to manipulate the situation in their favor to shift the difficulty rating down as far as they can to maximize their odds of success.
Which, in that regard, since you mentioned that die rolls are essentially contested.
Yeah.
If you're not dealing with another NPC or the like, what determines how many die the GM rolls? Is it meant to match the amount that the player is rolling, or
no?
Do you have something else in mind?
That's more of sort of like at that point it's up to the game master fiat to judge what an appropriate task is. But there's a generalized skill level. So like rolling one die is like untrained. You don't have anything going for you, so like that would be like a very simple task if you need to roll at all. 2 dice would be something that requires some amount of skill, like something that like a random guy off the street wouldn't necessarily be able to do readily. And then 3 dice, it's, you need someone with at least some, like a good amount of knowledge or expertise to attempt comfortably, and then beyond that it gets much more difficult. But most tasks will probably be just ranging from 1 to 3 dice. So, for example, you could have different levels of complexity for locks. So like a level 1 task, rolling 1d6 would be like a window latch. And then a level 2, rolling 2d6 would be like the standard padlock. And then level 3 would be maybe a lockbox, something that's more meant to be more secure and harder to pick.
And with that in mind, when it comes to character creation, we talked a bit about Mouse Guard and the fact that Mouse Guard is very much built around the PCs being members of the Guard. Given that you're going a bit wider, how do you maintain that same level of simplicity without becoming too sprawling? Just when it comes to the sheer possibility of ranges of animals.
Well, I mean, that's sort of the appeal, right? Is there is a wide range of animals to play as, not just a mouse like in Mouse Guard. And that's something that the players can limit depending on what setting they have in mind. So like comparing if they want to do like a Mist Mantle Chronicles adventure versus a Red Wool adventure, Mist Mantle Chronicles only has like half a dozen animals. Whereas Red Bull has a much wider selection.
Yeah, it's
basically anything in native to Northern Europe and England. But so
yeah, the question's more about making sure that during character creation, analysis paralysis is minimized.
Yeah, I mean, there's like everyone's got a favorite animal, right? So that's usually what the players that I've had in my play testing campaigns do. They gravitate towards like 1 or 2 animals, and they play those consistently. And they're not fantasy creatures, so you don't know what they are. Like, oh, I know that's a fox, I know that's a mouse, and you already have most people already have an idea of what that animal is, and any that they don't know, they're probably not going to want to play, or maybe they will just to find out more about that creature. So it's not a class-based system. So really, species is the most differentiating factor you're gonna have. to help define your character. But it takes into consideration things like age, your social status, like are you a chieftain or a local ruler, or are you just a wandering vagabond kind of thing? Because like I said, it's like an everyman kind of unlikely hero story that it's meant to accommodate. And there's procedures for randomly generating those details if you're unsure, or you just want to see what you get. So that it's more of a skill-based system than it is anything like classes like you get in D&D. It's not as rigid as that. It's very, very flexible, very fluid.
So, with that in mind, since map creation and exploring the map is a big part, is some of that a case of random generation off of tables, or is it a case of the kind of group activity map creation that some narrativist games have attempted over the years?
You could certainly take a more narrative approach if the game master wants to work together with the players to build the world. I've always relied on tables to create maps. I might have an idea of like where major locations or landmarks and other features would be located, placed on the map. But I usually, for generating the terrain at least, I've always used a table. So there's plenty of resources for that in the book. I've got resources for developing towns and other settlements, not necessarily like cities, but anywhere that one or more creatures could be calling their home, ranging anything from like burrows and dens to proper like medieval cities or thereabouts. In terms of exploration, I've tried to put a lot more emphasis on that than a lot of other games, because I know D&D, it has some travel rules, but I don't know anyone who personally uses them.
The travel rules, if I'm being honest, are half-assed.
That's what I've heard. So I've tried to do something a little bit more robust, since in many of the stories that I've used as inspiration, particularly Redwall, like the formula of those books, it's very formulaic for many of the books, and it always involves a cross-country journey akin to what you see in The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, where they're traveling like halfway across the continent, or at least for several days, roughing it out in the wilderness, trying to either track somebody down or find some settlement or location that they were told of and they need to go to accomplish a task. So in that respect, the journey is just as important as the destination. Because it's these stories, since they're animals, they're not really industrialized like we are. They still do animal things. They still, in many respects, live animal lives in a lot of the cases. So they're living in holes in the ground or in trees. So they're very much more reliant on natural features. So they forage in the woodlands, or fish and other things to supplement themselves and survive. They don't really tend to build a whole lot of actual houses. They sort of repurpose natural landmarks like caves and trees. So that's a consideration. In Woodlander, you're sort of expected to basically use bushcraft to survive out in the wilderness and contend with things like weather, rough terrain, and other obstacles like that.
Oh yeah, I can certainly get that. And I'm guessing that because of that, there's the possibility of running this game in a hex crawl format.
Yes, I use I've used well I use squares rather than hexes, but I use grid exploration for all of my campaigns.
Hmm.
Uh, in that respect, I've taken a lot of cues from older editions of D&D and OSR style games, which I think have a lot of the same sort of more grounded uh, sensibilities that I was looking for in terms of game design, as opposed to modern D&D, which is a lot more um, uh, fantastical, I guess you could say, much more bombastic. Like you said, the official travel rules are kind of lackluster.
Yeah, and I know why that is the case.
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of there can be several reasons why, and I'd say one of them is a lot of the people who could handle that sort of thing are not going to be in Hasbro directly, but also with D&D, because of the fact that it's never nailed down a proper foundation. It ends up getting pulled in a bunch of different directions all at once, and a bunch of audiences that want different things,
Mm-hmm.
each of which is going to result in contradictions with each other. So
Yeah.
imagine a tug of war with 5 people all using the same rope, just pulling it in different
Yeah.
directions, and you kind of get where things end up going. I think that's why in the decades since OD&D, you've had so many games that have a clear direction from the start in terms of what they're trying to be.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, I've come to that same conclusion. Like I can't really say about what it was like in the '80s, but I know like modern D&D, it's trying to be everything all at once.
which
Because it's taken like a lot of disparate genres and thrown them together. Like you got kung fu monks, essentially like steampunk robots, knights in shining armor, and like druids and other things just thrown together. Um, but in terms of travel, I think like either I think a lot of people, not modern players, either don't really want to deal with it, which I think is sort of a missed opportunity in terms of the sort of
I would argue
uh,
it's more of a case of I know a lot of people, especially in the pundit end of things, like to do this whole classic players versus modern players, old school versus new school, all that. I have a different theory, and that is that because the travel rules are so divorced from everything else, um,
mhm.
there's not an incentive to actually use them. Um,
Yeah.
it's in the same vein as things like encumbrance. Uh,
Hmm.
there's a lot of vestigial mechanics that come from that whole simulation mindset. Uh, since D&D has its roots in the wargaming scene of the 70s, and
Yeah.
that sort of we're trying to simulate this fantasy reality as close as possible, which results in very granular things that are there but don't have a reason to be that is integrated with the rest of the game, because
Mhm.
you look you look at a lot of early war games, and there isn't unified mechanics per se. There's a bunch of separate sub mechanics for different situations.
Yeah.
You wouldn't really see you wouldn't. I can't say exactly when it happened. I'd say maybe the early '90s, or late '80s, is when you start to see games that have a very all roads lead to Rome regarding their mechanics, i.e., a a particular core mechanic that everything is built around in one form or another, or informs everything around it. And when it
Yeah.
comes to travel time, uh, in part because of the whole trying to be not having a foundation, but in also not a incentive to actually use it, uh, it ends up creating something where you're not gaining anything by using it, and you're not losing anything by using it. So, um, so it's kind though it ends up being superfluous. Because
Well, it's
I look at that
yeah.
I look at that, and then I look at a game like, say, are you familiar with The One Ring? Um,
I haven't played it, but I looked into it, and
yeah,
it looked very like it does a lot of the same things that I was aiming to do with Woodlander.
yeah,
So it seems very appealing in that regard.
and its travel part is a central part of its system. What with you having to um, lay out the travel plan in a series of legs which have their own roles and their own consequences within it.
Mhm.
But it isn't just a case of it takes this amount of time to go this many miles, but there's nothing else there. There's actual mechanical weight to it. I think that's the dividing line.
I'd have to look more into that game's travel mechanics. Um, I watched a series of videos last year that was like briefly discussing things, but I don't think it didn't really go into a whole lot of detail in terms of
Yeah.
the travel stuff. But like everything else seemed very, very in line with what I was trying to do for my own game, which was enheartening to see. Because like I already made the comparison between the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit for um, things like Redwall, because it involves a lot of travel and being outdoors. So in that respect, that's where the meat of the stories are in both of those series, is going out and like you have a destination, but you got to find the route there. And that's the journey is the focus, not just as much, if not more so, than the end goal, the end destination.
Yeah.
Uh, so in that regard, I think like I've tried to make travel more engaging. I mean, players could probably just ignore it anyway. Like they're probably going to do that anyway, like they do with D&D. But I can't stop them from doing that necessarily. But as intended, you do. It's a bit more. It's granular than what it sounds like the One Ring uses. Like you said, it had legs of journeys. I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to look into that to understand that better, but it's more like a classic hex crawl where you plan a route on like what spaces you want to go, and they each have their own separate terrain. And it's sort of like do we go through the mountains, where it's going to be slower, but it's we travel a shorter distance, or do we follow the road and risk running afoul of like bandits or something? And that's sort of decisions I want, like the considerations I want players to be making, is like engaging more with the wider world. But beyond that, the Woodlander uses a central tension mechanic that is meant to be a through line from scene to scene, whether you're in a fight or traveling or resting, to as the name implies, is to maintain a sense of tension. And so traveling will rack up tension, fighting will rack up tension. Like anything that you do that could put your character at risk or draw attention to the party is gonna sort of build up tension. And when enough tension builds up, something's gonna happen. So the players won't necessarily know when that timer is gonna tick down. So they're gonna want to try to be efficient in how they plan their routes to, minimize the factors that would be accumulating tension. So that's the primary means by which random encounters are triggered. So it's not just an arbitrary game master okay, it's time for an encounter, or it's not as procedural as something you get in OSR games where you'd roll once per hex or once per turn while exploring a dungeon.
Yeah.
So in that way, it's meant to be a little bit more game master friendly, I suppose, because it's and player friendly, because it's not going to be as you're not going to have back-to-back encounters per se, but there's going to be a sense of we gotta watch ourselves so this doesn't get out of hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with that in mind, when it comes to that particular game loop that you have, I can see how this is going to be similar. How this is in a similar thought line to the One Ring. One of the things I am curious about, given the fact that you described combat as tactical and gritty, is, are you leaning into grid combat, or are you leaning into Theater of the Mind or a row system like some have done, or
a row system?
Yeah.
That's a new one to me.
Yeah,
game on that one.
There are some games like the simplified combat in Sword World, the One Ring once again, or Against the Dark Master, that instead of doing the grid combat approach, have it that player characters are acting on a series of priority ranks. The frontliners, then the rear guards, that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Usually on a phase system.
Yeah, I do know about One Ring's system for combat. I've designed it so it can be used in a variety of contexts. Ideally, be using a grid for more precise, granular movement and maneuvering and terrain and that sort of thing. But you could very easily use Theater of the Mind. It's not restricted to one system or the other, and I mentioned those, like both Theater of the Mind and grid combat, and even using something like zones more akin to something like Fate uses is, they're all valid. You just have to make some adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on how abstract you want it to be.
Yeah, I can get that.
So like sometimes, like for a big fight, or like something that the game master's scheduled ahead of time is like a big plot beat, you'd probably want an actual map to fight on, because it's meant to be like the big, like, third act big battle kind of conflict of the story. Whereas like impromptu random encounters can probably just stick to Theater of the Mind. So it's with Woodlander, the combat rules are meant to be consistent whether you're in a one-on-one duel or engaging with like two large-scale armies. It just depends. Like things get just a little bit more abstract. The more you zoom out, the more characters you include in the conflict. But the rules are consistent. So, in that regard, Theater of the Mind would be more appropriate for a big battle, whereas maybe Grid Combat would be more appropriate for a smaller skirmish.
Which certainly makes sense. But with that in mind, what would you be shooting for as far as the page count for the book?
The page count is just over 400, including the appendices with all of the item listings and stat blocks and things. But the actual rules are only about maybe 230 pages, so roughly half. So it's sort of a combination, it's a combination of D&D's player handbook, game master guide, and monster manual sort of rolled into one. Hence its length. It's meant to be comprehensive, and so it's got a lot of rules, a lot of content. I hope players will enjoy.
Yeah, I could see it. But with that, and to further go on to that, what are you shooting for as far as a release window? Not a date per se, but a general ballpark?
Well, the Kickstarter started on the 21st last month, so funding's going to go until a month after, from that date. That's when funding will conclude, and then it'll go into production and shipping. So if everything sticks to schedule, my backers will likely get their physical books sometime in June, if I remember correctly. So, because I've got the book ready, so everything's ready to go. It's just sending it out for production after the funding period is ended.
Yeah, I could see that. And I will look forward to seeing how it develops. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my monastery and enjoy the madness that happens around here. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
Yeah, it was nice talking with you. I hope the viewers and listeners got some more insight into my game and maybe get a little bit more excited to play it when it's actually delivered.
Oh yeah. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there'll be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody!